Is the US dollar dead, and is the Chinese yuan going to dominate the world? Welcome to China Insider. I'm David Zhang.
Mark my words. This way it's going to happen. We're going to have a banking collapse.
You've seen the headlines. The dollar is dead. Yuan will replace it. Time for a multi-currency world. Heck, even CNN and Fox News agreed on something. The dollar is no more. America will collapse, and the world will turn to the RMB as the new reserve currency. France just bought 65,000 tons of liquefied natural gas from China in its first ever yuan-denominated trade. Brazil, Russia, Saudi, Iran, and the rest of the BRICS nations, these headlines have been bombarding the news lately. But this was a yearly thing. Look at 2007, the story was the same. Sell the dollar, buy the yuan. Or this, from 1975, PetroYuan. I'm here to tell you that it's not going to happen. Or at least probably not now. But before we get started, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. And we appreciate you watching the show and helping our channel grow. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty technical reasons why the yuan isn't actually replacing the US dollar, let's focus on the reason these headlines are popping up. The Chinese Communist Party is waging information warfare. They want us to feel frightened. The truth is, Xi Jinping is creating a bipolar world where half of it is centered around China. The countries that are engaging in the transaction of yuan are what you would call allies of Xi and strategic partners in the region, including in Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. As Xi Jinping said, the century of change is coming. What better way to change that than to attempt to challenge the US? The CCP understands it would take a lot to overthrow the position of the United States, but waging an economic challenge is a good first step. I think, however, this cannot threaten the US dollar as it is, but does help China alleviate what I would call is the latch-on effect of working with the US dollar. Let me explain. One of the downsides of transactions performed with US dollars is that it is traceable. Follow the money. That's how Huawei's CFO Meng Wanzhou was found guilty of using third-party banks to provide Iran, which was sanctioned by the US, and she was caught. Having the global reserve currency status allows the US to sanction bad actors like Iran and Russia and to stop their international funds, as it is all done in the US dollars. There's been talk about how if the US dollar erodes or loses its value, then the sanctions won't be as effective. That's debatable. China, however, in fact, due to the sheer size of its economy, to a lesser degree would be affected if the US were to sanction them, but again, it doesn't help to be sanctioned. To alleviate the potential problems of the sanctions, Xi Jinping has been introducing what is known as internal circulation, in the case that China is isolated. The ability to survive without international trade is something that Xi Jinping wants to be prepared for, in case they invade Taiwan. Now, to expand the circle outside of China into what is now being considered as the communist global south, geopolitics consists that of allies of China. We're talking Russia, African nations, Latin America, Central Asia, and much more. In other words, allowing Xi Jinping to trade with these nations would still be considered internal circulation, but can be outside of the control of the US dollar. So if a big shift on the global stage were to take place and China and the US continue to decouple, the CCP can still maintain export and import to these nations, at least guaranteeing that using yuan as the currency can get them something in return. But that runs into a big problem. China's currency, the RMB or yuan, which literally stands for people's money, is not convertible. In short, because the Chinese government doesn't allow it to be traded globally, so the yuan is not fully exchanged monetarily. Now, what does that mean? Well, think of it like this. For example, Brazil and China are deciding to use their own currency in trade. So when Brazil goes to buy Chinese products, Brazil hands China a stack of yuan. Now that transaction works because Brazil is buying from China. Chinese goods are paid in yuan. Fair? What ends up happening is that fund is still being exchanged to that of the US dollars, regardless of how much, as the yuan doesn't actually hold value outside of China. Meaning, although Brazil paid in yuan, in actuality, they're simply using the US dollar, buying a stack of paper, the yuan in this case, and giving that stack of paper to China. Now, if China is buying products from Brazil to obtain the same value in goods, then they have to trade that stack of paper for the US dollar again. In other words, what is being played here is a triangular relationship that still ends up pointing to the US dollar. So those who hold yuan are left with the issue of keeping their yuan, which is barely used globally, or selling them for readily tradable currencies, and of course dealing with open and transparent financial architectures. And even the Chinese state media says that currently yuan is only accounting for about 7% of the global transaction. Plus, taking yuan internationally will only backfire for the Chinese Communist Party. More on that later. Think of yuan as a credit voucher, one where countries will have an agreement with China to use the yuan. They can trade for goods and services, kind of like a food stamp. What about PetroYuan? Well, let's factor in that this has been an argument since at least 1975. Well, since then, we have yet to see a dominating PetroYuan coming out. And this was since the 90s, right? The 2008 financial crisis, the 2020 oil fiasco, the last year Saudi and OPEC allegedly making moves to kick the United States out of the oil world competition. The current argument is based on the surge that in the use of the Chinese yuan to denominate Sino-Russia trade. Now, according to Russia Today, for example, the yuan's share in Russia's import and export settlements during 2022 jumped to about 23% and 16% respectively, up from just 4% and 0.5%. So this follows other initiatives to promote the yuan. China has created the so-called emergency yuan swap lines with some of the central banks. Now, of course, this is a bit to encourage more local currency trade financing that bypasses the US dollars. Couple that with Saudi, which is willing to use the yuan for transactions, this is being used as the point that the dollar is done. But again, we have to point out that this is all done regionally. This is not globally. This isn't affecting the global flow of trade. The use of yuan to settle more bills does not actually advance the cause of yuan as a reserve currency, let alone an alternative to the US dollar. The greater use of the yuan in trade with Russia actually reflects the country's inability to access US dollars freely, and its status as a vassal state of China. You might be extra confused. If what you're saying is true, then what exactly is the point of using yuan if they all get converted in the end anyways? Well, it's for optics, to show people that yuan is replacing the dollar. But the truth again is far from that. To become a reserve currency, you first have to export your debt. What the US has been doing for a very long time is allow countries to buy up their national debt, right? China holds a large amount of US debt. In doing so, they can exchange goods and export to the US for a big profit. What basically is doing is creating a trade deficit. Say China sells US $100 worth of goods. What is actually going on is that China gives the US goods and China gets dollars in return. Now, if China doesn't do anything, the supply of dollars that China has will increase, which will cause the relative value of the dollar in comparison to the Chinese yuan to go down. Now, this change in relative value would raise the price of Chinese goods sold to the US and lower the price of American goods sold to China. For the longest time, China wanted to export goods manufactured in China to the US, so they had to avoid that. Now, to avoid that, China buys US government debt with the dollars it gains in trade. Now, to oversimplify this whole thing, it basically means is the equivalent of a store giving you credit at the store for buying their things, and then when you pay, they will loan you the money back to get you to buy more. China actually artificially deflates its economy and its yuan value, so that way the same amount of US dollars can always buy more products from China, and in turn generating a larger profit for China. Now, the RMB or the yuan in reality doesn't have any value, or you could say that it is whatever the CCP tells it to be. And did you know that 70% of the so-called international trade for transactions done in RMB actually take place between China and Hong Kong? And of course, Hong Kong operates on a US dollar-based economy. So how exactly is trading with yourself international? Because of China's economic size, the yuan is capable and has the potential to become a reserve currency. But again, the Chinese regime's policy is stopping it. Now let's talk about, and you might actually be thinking, why doesn't China just make the yuan convertible and make it go global? And if they do, well, basically, they're going to make more people use the RMB, right? But the problem is when, where, and how they can no longer control it. That means they can't control the price of yuan. Basically, it boils down to two reasons why the yuan internationally won't actually happen. And both of them have to do with the Chinese Communist Party. For one, if it happens, Beijing can no longer deflate prices, meaning the huge trade deficit it is running against the United States to make more money on export will no longer exist. Remember, the US can be the reserve currency because it exports the debt. Now, all of a sudden, Beijing does not control the price. Beijing will not allow the price of RMB to move in a state that they can't control. The Chinese Communist Party hates uncontrollable risks. And if the RMB becomes uncontrollable, well, then that's a huge risk. And again, we know that China is not known exactly for its laissez-faire, right? It's policy-based central planning economy. And second, I think more importantly, is if Beijing announced on Chinese state media that the RMB would be freely convertible, the Chinese economy would collapse very fast. Why? Because the second it is done, people will be rushing to the bank to draw all of the money out, because no one actually trusts the yuan or the Chinese government. And that's because over the decades since China has been under the Communist Party, they've not gained the trust of being able to handle the economy without a government oversight watching everything. And guess what the banks would look like? Crashed and burns. Think of Silicon Valley Bank and Credit Suisse, but like 100 times more. Again, why am I saying this? As I said in the beginning, no one actually knows the value of the yuan or the RMB. It's been artificially manipulated by policy intervention from the CCP. If it was internationalized, countries would have to accumulate large claims in yuan. And that means either China has to run external deficits, which as a mercantilist state with a single-minded focus on industrial policy, it just will not. Or they allow a reserve currency to be freely withdrawn from the bank, and chances are, 10 minutes after it happens, all the banks will be dry of cash. China doesn't actually trust its own citizens to keep money at home. And like I said, the citizens don't trust China to keep the money to that value. So what they're going to do is it's actually going to result in the outflow of capital, and the fall in the yuan would destabilize its $60 trillion domestic banking system, in which the proliferation of bad debt is already a problem. If the banks run out of money, then the real estate sector crashes. The Chinese economy becomes crippled instantly. Now, combining that with the inflation inside China and the constant printing of money, we could see something like $1 equals 400,000 RMB. Think Venezuela. So what makes the dollar so dominant then? Well, because the way that the United States has been really good and trustworthy for a very long time, it has good credit, is never defaulted, so the risk is low. Now, traditionally, holding US debt is seen as a guaranteed safe risk environment. So the bonds, it refers to, of course, the US treasuries, which countries will buy, widely are regarded as the safest store of value in the world. And this perception is reinforced during moments of uncertainty, as we saw in the early days of COVID-19, or the 2008 financial crisis, or just anything that can see the stabilizing effects of the dollar. Investors would tend to rush to buy US debt during these uncertain times. People also trust that the dollar's value is very stable, which is backed by the management of the economy. And that's something, again, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't have. Take a look at this pie chart, which is the breakdown of the global currency right now. The US dollar has 60% of the shares of the foreign exchange. If, as the media claims, that the US dollar loses its reserve status, not a single one of the other currencies can replace its global trading value. Over the past 20 years, of course, the dollar has been steadily eroding. Now, I believe this is, of course, because of the domestic policies that we can offer fair criticisms on. Nothing dramatic here, though, about a 12% drop over about 22 years. Meanwhile, real trade with the RMB happens between China and Hong Kong. And again, if you remember, about 75% of that is done between Hong Kong and mainland China. So if you back out of that 75% of the transactions, RMB as a share of global payments puts China something near like the Mexican pesos or the Polish zloty. By this point, you're either convinced or you still have your worries. Well, it's fair. It's a complex topic. I don't dare to claim expertise on. These are just my understandings. Now, other than do your own research, I think it's worth to point out a few signs or warnings. The first is that there's motives from China to do this because it wants to challenge the US in its narratives, in its economic position, of course, to eventually overpower the United States. And what it's doing is rallying authoritarian nations, and they want to see the benefit of being close to China. By creating a regional currency among the circle, it benefits China in times of uncertainty. Second, the US dollar is a slow decline, and it would actually take decades to challenge, but the decline is happening, which means that it's a caution for Americans to focus on electing people and getting people to do the job. And I'll leave you with this. China simply cannot challenge the global order, and the US dollar, as it is, fundamentally prone to corruption, policy problems, and a lot of communist overdoing and complicating things. All right, that's it today for the topic of de-dollarization. Is it happening? Is it not? This is China Insider. I'm David Zhang. Before we go, please subscribe to our channel. And if you enjoy the content so far, like this video and comment below what your thoughts are about our topic today. All right, until next time, take care. Bye-bye.